All right, we are continuing with our Genesis chapter 1. We have gotten, before we get into the main thing we're going to talk about today, this word came up. We talked about it just briefly last week, very, very briefly. Vault and expanse, and it just so happens that we were talking with T-Bone on Sunday night, and his Hebrew class just talked about this. And I was wondering if T-Bone wanted to provide us a little bit of insight in this word from the Genesis 1 account. Because I think in every account where we have gotten input from folks about what did you see in the first chapter, we get to the word vault, expanse, firmament, right? It's the same word being translated for all of those. Each time we've discussed it, somebody different has said, "What's with that word?" And I think T-Bone had a little bit of insight, which is maybe that it was just an odd word. Did you want to?
Oh, it's so in the Hebrew.
Oh, and I don't think I turned that on. Press the button. Sorry.
That's okay. So even in the Hebrew, when you look up the word, you have to do, I'm going to say, several lookups because the word is a key that's actually used there.
No, they're all frowning like here.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
So there's different. Think of synonyms. Kind of when you think about this word for vault. And so it's one of those Hebrew words that when you look it up, when you first look it up, you're like, there's no definition for it, but then you have to go back to a root. And it has this whole idea, at least from a Hebrew perspective, when we talk about vault or expanse, the whole idea of beating like a piece of metal out to spread it across something, to beat it, whatever, into a certain form. And so that was actually, if you were speaking to someone who's speaking Jewish, that's kind of how they would actually be visualizing it in their mind when they see this word, firmament, vault, expanse, to be beating something out actually from a physical perspective. One of the hard things is it's because the word that is used for us, which was a French word, what I learned, firmament, it's just hard because it doesn't have that same picture as the word does actually in Hebrew. So, yeah.
Great, thank you for adding that, Andy. It was funny because we were talking about this on Sunday night, and I had just listened to a rabbi talking about that same word and talking about in Job, it has the same idea, same words being used as God has like beaten out this arc that you see in the expanse, as you look across the sky, and it shines and it looks like metal almost, right, is the idea. And so, these speaking in pictures, right, we don't always get the idea of what those pictures come across. And then we're trying to get those pictures and translate it into some English words, and things kind of fall apart quickly. There are a couple other places that Michelle learned recently about, which I think we'll talk about. Words I'm not supposed to say anymore, but I'm going to talk about these in a future sermon. Sin, like we have the word sin, and what was the other one, Michelle, that you said?
Iniquity.
Iniquity, sin and iniquity, but there are a bunch of Hebrew words, 8 Hebrew words that we translate into sin and iniquity, and each of those words have a different picture behind them, a different way of seeing what it is that's happening. Like, one is you're walking down a path and you've stepped off the path. One is like you've taken a thing and you've twisted it up, right? Like these ideas of these words are very rich in their imagery, and we say sin and iniquity, like boring, right? Like, so I think coming back to some of that richness will be helpful in the future. All right, so continuing on, tonight's class, we have moved into now taking and looking at this creation account and Shabbat itself. So in this first bit of what I've been calling the first creation account, because what follows this appears to be another creation account, and we'll talk about those when we get to it. We talked that this is a chiasm, and then it begins with nothingness and it ends with rest, nothingness, and in the middle of the chiasm is this word, moed, and moed is a series of, can be a series of different types of festivals, Sabbath being one of them. And Sabbath appears to be a central theme. This idea of resting seems to be a central theme of the first Genesis account. And so I wanted us to talk more about Shabbat and connecting to Shabbat. So the homework that you had was to go and just like look up Sabbath. And there were a lot of different ways you could have done that. And depending upon like the version you used or whatever, there's like 130 something to 160 something Sabbaths, right? Like there are a lot of Sabbaths in the Bible. And I wanted you to get like a feel of what is Sabbath, just by taking a broad look across that where it's being used and drawing something out of just looking at those. So this is the part where you get to say, what did you find? When you were looking through and just kind of getting an idea of Sabbath, what did you find about Sabbath? What stood out? All right. So one thing is it's very important. Like almost every single time that you read about Sabbath, there's some important aspect about Sabbath that's being discussed. Yeah. So it's an important thing. Anything else?
I noticed that it was also in the New Testament more than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
And of course, obviously in the Old Testament is where most of it is, but in the New Testament, he carries it, it's carried over
Yes.
to get an idea of us.
Yes. All right. So Sabbath is carried over, and we see it a lot in the New Testament, whether to invoke an idea or a concept, or because there's something about Sabbath in particular that's happening that Christ is talking about. Great observation. Anything else?
First time I think I found it, it's just the word rest.
Okay. The word rest. Yeah. So that is a key element of this idea of Sabbath or Shabbat is that there's rest. You're a slave coming out. Rest is a pretty cool idea, right? Let me ask some leading questions here. Who's resting on Sabbath? Yeah, everybody and everything. Everything rests on Sabbath. The people that are in your land that aren't the Jews, the animals are resting. There is a Sabbath for the land, right? Lots of things. This idea of Sabbath being applied to things, it's applied to a lot of different things. A lot of different things are going to have a Sabbath. Even when we look at Jeremiah's prophecy that they're going to be 70 years before something happens, it says 70 years so that the land can Sabbath. Right? And when the land has finished its Sabbath, then something will occur. Like, why is the land having to Sabbath? What's the deal there? Like, why for 70 years does it have to Sabbath? What occurred? So this idea of Sabbathing is applied to a bunch of different things. Okay, any other thoughts that you saw or things that you noticed?
My favorite thing that I noticed was, and I'll just read it, Ezekiel 20 says, I also gave them my Sabbaths as a reminder of our relationship so that they would know that I, the Lord, sanctified them.
Okay, I also gave them my Sabbaths so that they would know that I am the Lord. No.
As a reminder of our relationship.
As a reminder of our
And it's
relationship.
Sabbaths, it's plural.
Yes.
I thought that was interesting.
Okay.
But it just was more, like, brought us back to that relationship.
Right. So he gave them, and it was Ezekiel which?
2012.
Ezekiel 20:12. The Sabbaths were given to remind them of the relationship. Now, Sabbaths, we had the list of the moads up there in a moment ago, right? There are a lot of things that are Sabbaths that are called out. The lands take Sabbaths, the days, the seventh day is a Sabbath, right? There are Sabbaths that are occurring. And in that Sabbath, here's a very key thing. We are to remember a relationship that we have with God. So that is why he gave it to the people. So you can remember this relationship. We're going to talk. Michelle keeps telling me I keep saying that. I do not know why I say that. I got to stop. We're going to talk more about this later. If I say that again, just look at me like, what are you talking about? Okay. So God giving Sabbath to the people is for a reason. And that's like the first thing that we should just call out. Is like God doesn't give them some special day just because he's a bummer, right? Like you can only work on 6 days, and on that seventh one, good luck figuring out what you're going to eat. Ha 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 ha. Right? Like that's not the point. God has given them this because there's something they're supposed to get from it. And here's probably the key point. You're going to get from it that we have a relationship. You're running around 6 days a week doing junk, and I need you to remember that you and I have a relationship. That's the whole point. That's why I created you. That's why I rescued you out of Egypt. That's why, like, God wants that relationship with his creation.
I kind of got buried in an article by the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, but it talked about the Sabbath theology, and that's what Michelle was dealing with. And one of the things it says the Sabbath is an invitation to rejoice in God's creation and to recognize God's sovereignty over our time.
Okay. Love it. Do you want to repeat that again? Nice and loud.
The Sabbath is thus an invitation to rejoice in God's creation and recognize God's sovereignty over our time.
Right. I think there are, for me, as I first hear that, there are three really key points in that. It's an invitation that he gives to his creation for them to recognize the creation itself and that he's sovereign over time itself. Right?
And the gifting idea is significant.
It is, yeah. Can you just even think about that? Like, you're a slave and now you get a day off? Right? That's pretty awesome.
But is it about your day off?
It's not
There's
about
where
your
we
day
get all
off.
caught up. Is it about me and what I get, or is it about something else?
Okay, so it's setting aside that day for something. And one of the things you read in there, what was the first thing about the creation?
It's an invitation.
The invitation to what?
To rejoice
To
in God.
rejoice in the creation. In fact, if we look at the Sabbaths, they're almost all like the moads, like the festivals, all but the one are like raucous parties, basically. Like they're really partying it up. There's the one that not so much, but God asks his people, hey, you need to party a bit. And you're going to remember some things like our relationship in that, and you're going to remember, I think, some other things about creation. We'll get to that as we're probably digging in.
Just thinking the invitation to rejoice idea is parallel to our communion.
Yeah, okay.
It's an invitation to rejoice based on something God has done. It's awesome.
Yeah. Okay.
In the New King James Version, I kind of looked in two different
Yeah.
versions. And one of them in Romans 9:29 says something of, like, I just kind of took a little note. The Lord of the Sabbath, we need it because if we didn't have it, we would be like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So Sabbath maybe recenters us. Otherwise, we become like Sodom and Gomorrah. What is the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? What was that? Hospitality. Sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is hospitality. It's called out in multiple places in the Old Testament. That what they weren't basically doing is being hospitable, taking care of one another. Sabbath somehow will cure us of that. Yes?
In Genesis 2:2, Genesis 2:2, I've got the King James Version, and it says that, it's verse 3. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. What's another word for sanctify?
Made it holy.
Set apart.
Set it apart. It's special, something special. Yeah, and he's setting apart time as opposed to place, right? It's not that he's sanctified ground or a place or some region or a tree or a thing, but he sanctified this section of time is now set aside and something special about it. All right. So on Sunday, I talked about this. So, Chayei Olam. And so this was eternal life, right? We found out like this is that idea of a life focused on the eternal. And when did the life focus on the eternal begin? Like now, right? Like the whole thing was you could either be living a life that's focused on I wake up, I do work, I eat, I sleep again, I wake up, I do work. Like that was the debate going on at the time. There's like these two different types of lives you can have. One that's eternal life and one that is worldly life. And the idea of eternal life really changes our point of view that it starts now. It's not something that happens when we die and then we begin it. It begins immediately for us. The other part of this that we discussed is that God has always wanted a relationship with his creation. And so the point of the death of Christ is not the forgiveness of your sins. The point of the death of Christ is to reconcile you back to God. So if the reconciliation back to God is the point, and we think about the Ezekiel thing that Michelle just read, where the whole idea of I gave you the Sabbath so that you could have a relationship with me, like that's the point of what God's trying to do, then I want to hearken us back to a sermon I did long ago, which was making space for God. And one of the things I talked about in that sermon was we have to, like one way to make space for God is to set aside time. Don't fill it with anything. Allow God to fill it. Or to set it aside without work or me involved. To set it aside for some other purpose. In essence, to Shabbat or Sabbath. Now, for us, Shabbating and Sabbathing might look different. And let me address this right now. Again, I've said this a couple times. Very often we're so quick to think about things that we don't have to do anymore that we forget the value of why God gave them to his people. Why did God give Sabbath to the people? So they could remember that they had a relationship with God. Do you think that's changed today for us? Of course not. God still would love it if we took and set some time aside in which we haven't filled it up with all the other things that we do and think are important that are like set aside to Shabbat.
Is this an okay time to ask that question?
You can go ahead and ask it, but I might not answer it. But I think it's a good question.
So I always wondered why we seem to replace Sabbath with first day of the week. And I know they met on the first day of the week, but when I was looking at this, I was like, oh, I wonder if it was because they
Well, they absolutely work together.
Yeah.
I actually thought you were asking me something different earlier.
Oh.
So imagine this, right? When does Sabbath begin?
Friday night.
Friday night, as the sun is setting. When does it end?
Saturday,
As the sun begins to set. And then what is beginning? Sunday. You could break your Shabbat and begin your Sunday worship immediately. I was thinking about that as you asked me the question. I'm like, how
That's
cool
what
is
I was
that?
thinking that was kind of.
Right? That's very cool. Not something I want to talk about at the moment.
No,
But,
that's fair.
so I want to throw up this quote and then go through a few things and then talk more about what it might mean for us to set time aside for God. So Heschel wrote this book called The Sabbath. He's a Jewish scholar. It's a beautiful book. If you love to read stuff like that, it's not very big. It's a short book, very short, but it's very poetic. And you will have more quotes coming from this book, but I love this one. There's a realm of time where the goal is not to have, but to be. Not to own, but to give. Not to control, but to share. Not to subdue, but to be in accord. Life goes wrong when the control of space, the acquisition of things of space, becomes our sole concern. And I think that's true. When our sole concern deals with the space of everything that we're in all the time, and we don't set time aside to no longer acquire, but to instead share, and no longer to own, but to give, and no longer to have, but to be, things get out of whack. Because that's really not how we were created to be. In fact, you become completely empire, right? You're completely trying to acquire and to get and to have and to more and to get more and to be involved in more of this world. And you're not switching over into this thing that God has really set aside for us to gain a relationship with Him. Like, when do we set that time aside? When do we take something and become, set a little bit of time aside to do that?
I'm just thinking this seems to me to be a kind of a move from what I might call a quasi-love or a 50-50, maybe double-minded man love to true agape love. And we all, I think, are still in transition on that process somewhere.
Yeah. One of the really interesting things that I've been doing a lot of reading about Shabbat over the last month and a half or so, 2 months now. One thing that seems to come up in the writings over and over and over and over again is not, it's that this time has been set aside to be special. It's a time that you've set aside to do something different. And there are 6 days, just to take it in the word of Sabbath, right? There are 6 days in which we work and we toil and we build and we make and we exchange and we buy and we sell and we do all these different things. There are 6 days that we do that. But there's one day where we're going to do something different. In time, we're going to set that aside and do something different. And the point that gets made over and over and over again is not that every day you live like Sabbath. Sabbath is set aside to be special and different, and that's okay. And for me, right, as a Christ believer, what struck me about that is I have a day that I live, and I live in and out of day all the time. But do I take in that day and set aside a time in which I'm not doing that anymore? I purposely set aside that time to be in God. That's why that time has been set aside. It's not to watch a movie or listen to music, or it's not to, whatever happens to be. It's set aside for something else. I've got all these other days, I've got all these other hours that I can do other things, but have I set time aside as a gift from God to actually build the relationship with God? On Sunday, I used the image of the canoe, right? Or really it was a kayak. You could either be paddling your kayak, that's a certain type of prayer. It's the one where we're usually petitioning God for something. But then there was like, pray without ceasing. That's like floating in God. That's something different. That's abiding. That looks different. And I think Sabbath looks like abiding. That's the idea. Now I'm going to put T-Bone on the spot just for a moment, if he doesn't mind. Because I know T-Bone has been working on a exercise or a practice to Shabbat daily for a period of time. And I was wondering if you could share with us, like, what does that look like? What's the point?
Well, I mean, it depends on.
Oh, and could you use the mic?
Yeah, so it depends on, the day and what's going on, but for me, I'm trying to set aside at least 30 minutes to, I'm going to say for me, what it's doing, it's enhancing my relationship, of course, with God. I'm going to say is the outcome. And then there's different ways that you can do it. Okay, so like even on the way here, there's just a song that I love, which I've done the lesson on Jireh, right? And so I bring those words, to mind. I'm already loved. I'm already forgiven. I'm already chosen. You're more than enough in every circumstance. You're more. So those words are just kind of going over, and it's just allowing me to just actually celebrate who God is and my being and who He's called me to be. Now, what is interesting though, because now as I'm studying my Hebrew, something else has come up for me, and it's the whole idea of even before I go to sleep. So in the New Testament, when Christ is on the cross and He says, I commit my spirit, right? Well, in the Hebrew, it's not commit. It's like I deposit my spirit to you. So it's like I'm giving it to you to do something with it, to restore it, and then give it back to me. So now before I go to sleep, I kind of think of that same mentality as, okay, I'm depositing my spirit to you, restore it however, so then when I wake up, I'm renewed and I'm refreshed, right? And it just brings a whole different mindset, whatever, to just even of rest, right? My nefesh is, okay, there it is. If you give it back to me, that's great, right? Restore it.
I heard a wonderful lesson on this.
Oh, did you?
From that rabbi that I've been telling you, that I've mentioned before, Rabbi Foreman. I listened to 2 weeks ago, where there's the idea of your rest, and that idea of what you say is that you are depositing your spirit with God. Does anybody know where your spirit goes at night? Do you have any idea what you do when you fall asleep? Like, no, right? Like, I have no idea what my spirit's doing when I've fallen asleep. I don't know. But I've given it to God, and in the morning, it's like we were teasing about rebooting before class started, right? It's as if you reboot in the morning, like, boom, okay, I'm running again. He gave it back to me, which Rabbi Foreman points out is like practice, because at some point, we deposit our spirit, but we don't get it back here. We get it back somewhere else. It's like a journey that we make every single night. We don't know where our spirit's gone. We've deposited it with God. We entrusted Him to take care of it, and He will restore it to us in the morning. And at some point, we also have trust in Him that we have deposited our spirit with you, and you will take care of it when we die, right? There's a longer journey, but we don't have to worry about it because we make these shorter ones every night. And He's faithful to restore it every day. Sorry, I'm on a tangent now. All right, thank you. So the word Shabbat means not moving or stillness. And from that we get rest. So Genesis chapter 8, verse 22. Which I had up and then I managed to close. All right, this is post-flood. While the earth, God talking here, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. And that word at the end is, they shall not be still. It's the same word as Shabbat. In fact, it is Shabbat. It's not the same word. It is Shabbat. So, the earth, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not Shabbat. Things will continue. They'll keep moving. They'll keep doing. And that kind of gives us an idea of then Shabbat is not doing these things, right? It's not, there's a stillness to things. The other word that you probably noticed as you were looking is you were to guard the Sabbath or watch the Sabbath. And the word is shamar. So you're to shamar the Sabbath. And the question is like, how do you guard or protect the Sabbath? Like, what's the point of guarding and protecting, or how would you do that? And the first place we see this word is actually in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Then God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and tend, or shamar it, to guard it, to keep it. So we translated that to tend the garden. Some of your translations might say keep the garden, to guard the garden. Now, is he guarding the garden? Not in the sense of we're going to protect the garden, right?
There wouldn't be any weeds. What do you need to tend? All you had to do was pick fruit and eat it. So what was the tending involved?
Oh.
I guess wondering about that all.
Yeah, okay. So, good question. What would it mean then to tend the garden if the garden doesn't need work? Like, if there aren't weeds growing, what does he need to be doing?
Pruning it.
Maybe he's pruning it. Maybe. In what way would you guard or shamar the garden and shamar or guard Sabbath? How might those be related? Thinking about what we now know a little bit more about what the purpose is of Sabbath and why we have Sabbath.
It needs to treasure it. It needs to have some type of value where he actually treasures
Okay,
it.
so there's a treasure to it. You value it. You're keeping an eye on it. And in some way, you might be protecting it by watching to make sure it's not getting, pushed around.
The
And
deer aren't
I was
eating
thinking
bushes.
earlier, like, how we can take anything that's a gift, and as soon as you say, do this, oh, well, now I have to do it, now it's a burden, right?
Yeah.
And in that keeping, you might be keeping other, to me, 24 hours with every week with nothing to do. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know, right?
You get to sleep 8 hours.
Cool.
But like,
Maybe sleep in
every,
back.
like I can
Start
say,
it.
like, this one day is great, but like every single week, keeping
Yeah.
things come up and you put it on the calendar, and so guarding it would be like, oh no, nothing's going there, that's special.
Okay. Yeah. So guarding it, keeping it special, keeping it. In some ways, like we try to guard the Lord's Supper, right? In the sense of we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get ourselves back into making sure that it stays special and something that doesn't become just, yeah, here we are this week doing the same thing with the same words.
Bonnie used the word appreciate.
Oh, appreciate, I missed that. Yeah, great, Bonnie. Yeah, it's appreciated. So if you are a Jew, really one great advantage to this is it's communal. Everybody's doing it. Like if you're in Israel and the horn goes off, there are no more cars driving around. It's easier to keep Sabbath when everybody's keeping Sabbath. Nobody's like planning a soccer game in the middle of your Sabbath, right? It's just not happening. For us, if we want a Sabbath or Shabbat or take and carve time out, like we're picking some time and now maybe needing to be a little bit flexible about it too, right? We need, maybe going back to that Heschel quote, like, is there some place where we're recognizing the accord that needs to exist or the giving that needs to happen? In the end, it's not really about me, it's about something else that I'm doing inside of it. There needs to be a little bit more flexibility, right? Like to Shabbat in our culture as somebody who's trying to use this time to build a relationship back with God, maybe we're doing it for a half an hour, maybe we're doing it for an hour in a day. Like there's some amount of time that I've set aside because I recognize that God reconciled me to have a relationship. And one of the things he did was to sanctify and set time aside to allow us to build that relationship. And I feel every moment with everything else that has going on, where have I spent any time to work on that relationship with God that he clearly desires and has provided a mechanism for us to use to spend time with him, right?
Can I ask T-Bone a question?
Yeah, of course. Always ask T-Bone questions. I love it. Only if he answers with the mic.
How do you, now I know you mentioned the song that you're writing or that's in your head. How do you set that time aside doing nothing? Like, how do you turn off your head? I mean,
you have to practice, but so for me, I schedule it, but schedule it just gives me the flexibility. So it doesn't always have to happen at that time. So sometimes it'll actually happen in the morning or it'll happen during the day, or I'll even just get up in the morning and just go out in the backyard. And I like to garden. So I'll just sit there with the plants, right? And I use that time, right?
and do you find yourself thinking, well, is a half an hour up?
No, I don't.
But I can imagine initially.
Yeah, when you
would be
first
doing
start,
that.
you do. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
when you first start. But then as you sit there and whatever, if you want to call it contemplative work, it's just like talking to God all the time. Pray without ceasing. You're having this conversation. You're having this celebration, whatever. And when you're in this space that you enjoy, it's like time. It's like, oh, I need to get back to whatever it is that I was
You're
doing.
not praying. I mean, sometimes maybe you're not praying at that time. You're just.
Well, for me, praying is just a continual thing, right? So I'm always talking with God. So I don't have to like do a formulaic, like as I'm sitting there watching that plant and I'm just thanking him so much for that plant that's there, whatever, that I either get to eat or that I'm, gardening or whatever. So it's the whole goal for me is to keep that relationship continual to the point, as we talk about like eternal, it's always now. So it's not like I have to transition to this place. It's being in that place, being in that state.
I think maybe like not necessarily petition first, but it's not like you can't pray during Shabbat.
No, I mean, back, yeah.
Like
we
I
will.
I think the sitting there empty almost makes it sound like you're trying to not think about
Yeah.
anything.
My intent is for us to spend actually probably 2 more classes talking about some different ideas of what folks do, Christian folks do during their Shabbat time, how they use it. Like, I think it's a great question. Like, what in the world do you do for half an hour, right? It really is such a great question. Is like, especially for. I'm not going to make the assumption that you all are like me, but I will fill every waking moment of my life doing something, and I will overload it so that I'm double booked for everything. and I only sleep like 5 to 6 hours a night. So I've got a lot of time that's completely packed and filled. And so it's uncomfortable for me to even think about taking a half an hour and doing nothing. So I'm not going to say you're saying that, but for me, it's very uncomfortable.
Yep. Two things: Shabbat and making a place for God. They're about the same in my mind. One of them has a more formal background. The other is a little more obvious.
Yeah.
But when we talk like we are right now, it dawns on me how much of our lives are, I'm going to use the word squandered, are squandered and keep us from the blessings God has for us in whatever is beyond this beautiful striving process to grow. Whatever is above or part of the growth on the way up, by virtue of the fact that I'm squandering making the place and the time, I'm not getting this.
Yeah.
And so then I sit there and I pray to the Lord for more zeal. And I think, are you just going to hand that to me, or is zeal going to be something that's going to come from some other direction?
Right.
And maybe we're getting close to the how of becoming awakened, excited Christians. We'll be blessed if we do. We know that much.
Let me give us another thing. One of the things I'm trying to do tonight, and I don't feel like I'm doing a very good job of it, but I just wanting us to talk about Shabbat and Sabbath, because it's something I think we don't talk about, first of all, but also I want us to start recognizing it's time with God. It's time that's set aside. Now let's think for a moment about space and place and things. God specifically tells his people not to create things that represent him in space. You never approach God in space. It doesn't happen. That's the whole idea of not creating an idol. God interacts with his creation and his relationship not in space, but in time with his people, always, over and over and over again. He sets aside times for them to come and commune with him and to interact with him. And for us, we talk about coming to the church building, but what we really mean is we are coming at a time to worship God. It doesn't matter if it's here or down at the park, or it just doesn't matter where it is, right? The where is not important. The space is not important. It's the fact that we've set time aside that we're now actually praising and communing with God. And if we think about our lives and how we actually interact with God, it's always in time. And so the idea of Shabbat is that it's been sanctified and set aside so that you can build a relationship with me. Now do that, right? Like take the time and set it aside and do that. And when we fill it up with all these other things, then I kind of like Phil's term they just used a moment ago, we kind of squander it all, right? Like, you had 7 days in a week and you squandered all 7. There's this other Jewish saying that Sabbath occurs whether you recognize it or not. Every single week. The land might recognize it, the creation without you will recognize it, but it's up to us to recognize time with God and to create that time.
Can I ask a question? I decided probably about a year ago, I guess, that I was going to try to start set time. When I got up, the first thing I was going to do was sit down and pray for whatever it was that I was praying for, usually for brothers and sisters in Christ, loved ones that are lost. And there was a need physically within the brotherhood. And that can shift a little bit on certain days, like Sunday morning type of situation. But I've held pretty close to that. Is that something we would consider Shabbat?
I'll tell you the one secret I've learned. If you're asked if you're Shabbating correctly, you're not. That's the one thing I've learned. I think what we're trying to do, right, is make time to build our relationship with God. And there are different ways that we interact with that. People talk about taking strolls in the park with their family. They talk about, like, there's a lot of different things. And because when we think about it, what is it that we're connecting with? And I'm going to leave that as a question, and I'm going to give maybe one answer at the end here. But, you know, what is it during that time that we're utilizing to connect with our relationship with God?
And just for me, it's just that, and this is just the way that I think, it's like sometimes the mentality is, I'll just do it when I get there on Sunday, right? I'll give them that time. Now, to me, where I'm at now, I'm like, wow, that's selfish. I mean, I've taken the whole week, whatever, for myself, and I'm just gonna whatever for Sunday. So it's like, so my goal for me is to have that relationship just with them each day. And when I do, what I realize is just not based upon the stuff that I'm doing, right? It's based upon who He has created me to be. And then that relationship with Him, right? And then I'm like, oh my goodness, now I'm really more, thankful for reconciliation and love and stuff, because you're showing me who I am and who you think I am, and this relationship and all this stuff that you're giving me, so this relationship can continue on and on, right? And so then it just makes me even more appreciative, right, in that relationship with Him.
The word abiding again comes to my mind, but I think what we're talking about, abiding is a connection. It's the willingness to make that space so that God abides with us. He doesn't go anywhere. It's us that float around and get lost in this thing. And ours is to be aware of our being in His presence. And that needs to be a continual thing, really. Can I attain to that? No, but I can work on it.
But and it requires practice, right? Like, it's kind of why some time is set aside. But the idea is that we abide in Christ, we abide in God, right? We abide in Him. But we need to set time aside to practice abiding, then to be able to abide, right? Like otherwise, I don't know how else we're going to do it. It doesn't just happen. This quote from Isaiah I really like, Isaiah 58. If because of the Sabbath, God talking to His people, if because of the Sabbath you restrain your foot from doing as you wish on my holy day, so you basically stop yourself from doing something you were wanting to go do. You're not thinking about you now, right? If you've stopped and restrained yourself, and call the Sabbath a pleasure. Okay, so it's not now, I'm not going to do what I want to do, and therefore, I'm kind of stupid Sabbath. It's in my way. I wanted to go do whatever. Now I can't do it. And call
And you do something else.
and call the Sabbath a pleasure, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure, and speaking your own word. Okay, so not about me. Then you will take delight in the Lord. And I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. What I love about this is, if I stop with all this stuff of me and take some time and set it aside, then you will take delight in the Lord. It's like the recognition of that relationship by taking and setting the time aside and not being consumed with whatever it is that I'm consumed with, right? And for me, this is really impactful. It reminds me that being purposeful in setting time aside is an important thing. You know how when I preach, I usually say this is like a sermon for me. This is a class for me. So, I need this.
It's a class for all of us, Michael.
So I'm going to leave you with this Marty Sullivan quote. Sabbath should be a day that sets us free to remember what is most true about God's creation. It was good. And I think when we look at that first creation account, there are a bunch of things that we pull away and look at and see in that as we are Shabbating, we remember. We remember, one, that it was good. The things that God created and made, he made as good things. The other thing that I think we see in that is he gave them rest. He gave this people that came out who were a bunch of slaves who made bricks all the time and their value was based upon that. He suddenly said, you know what, you get a day off, you're going to spend the time with me, and your value is not based upon how many bricks you make. I just think you're good. I think I created something that's pretty good. Not based upon what you produce, but the relationship that you have with me because I'm your creator. I think that's a huge thing that we try to remember as we're Shabbating. That we're valuable to the Creator, and the Creator wants us to have a relationship with Him. Not based upon my ability to produce and create things over and over and over again for the world, but my ability to have a relationship with Him, right? So those are two of the things. Maybe think more for yourself about what are the types of things that we see in that creation account, or just in general, that remind us if we take and separate a little bit of time. Like if you separated a half an hour, I don't know about you, but when I think about it, half hour doesn't seem like very long until you try it. But a half hour doesn't seem like very long, right? Like, can I set aside a half an hour? Probably. Would it be good for me? Absolutely, right? All right. What I would like is for you to think throughout this week a little bit about, sometimes we call them just like spiritual practices, things that we might do to enhance our relationship with God, right? Like if the point of it was reconciliation because God wants to have a relationship with us, and then we spend no time, and eternity already started, like it starts now, we're in it now, it is the now, and we're not spending any time with God because we're waiting to die so that we can start it, that seems like we've kind of messed it all up. What types of things can we be doing? I hate to use that word, but like how do we change in such a way where we're taking time and using it to build our relationship with God? And I'm going to use the term Shabbat for that. I'm not going to use it as the seventh day set aside as holy, but I'm going to use it as time that we have set to be still in God because He wants to build a relationship with us. And think of that as Shabbat. Okay, so that's our homework, because I want us to come back. I'll talk a little about some things that I've read about or heard about. I can tell you I am not good at this at all, and I'm hoping to start it with you all. And I want us to like exchange some ideas and talk about like how we, in essence, enhance our relationship with our Creator.
Would eventually, and Thibault, maybe I'll ask you this question, the little 30-minute sections that we're talking about, would those eventually maybe grow into kind of a more fluid, all the time idea?
Do you have a thought?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you're kind of defining it. Then you're starting to move back over to the do, right, mentality. Whereas your state is your state, right? So you're creating this relationship in state where you're just in constant whatever relationship with God, but it's not like, oh, jump in, jump out, jump in, jump out. But it's being enhanced, right? Enhanced. So, you know, wherever you are, whatever state, whatever. I don't know. You kind of get to that point. That's why it's like you have to practice it, right? And it's going to be different for each and every person. But the thing is, your goal is to figure out what it is, right? What it is for you, and you can learn maybe what other people. But That's what's so neat about it. It becomes personal.
Right. Yeah. The one thing about that question that, as someone who doesn't know, but simply has read a lot recently, is the constant coming back to, you got 6 days that you are to work and to do and to create, but there's a one set of time that's set aside special in a way. But what we know about our lives in God, and what he expected of his people back then too, was that they're constantly in God, right? That's not changing. So what's different between the 6 days and the seventh day? It's not suddenly they are in a relationship and before they weren't in a relationship on the 6th, right? It's something else that's being enhanced during that time. It's time that is set aside for something special. And it maybe enhances your other 6 days because of the practice, right? If we're thinking about it as days. All right. Probably talked far more than I should have, which I hear, according to Proverbs, only fools do, but here we are.